All right, and welcome to this HTML tables crash course. We're going to be taking you all the way from knowing nothing, beginner, all the way through advanced tables with advanced CSS styling. Now, tables have been around on the internet forever. I used them back in the 90s when I began working on the internet. Now, today, we're no longer doing layout and multi-column layouts with HTML tables, but you do use tables quite often in your web work for tabular data. So it's just a matter of time until you run into tables. We're going to be looking first at the basic syntax, then we're going to be covering some of the more advanced things with tables, such as colspans and rowspans, merging cells together. And then finally, we'll finish off with the real-world example where we're going to build a table from scratch, complete with full CSS styling and some fancy tricks to make it look a lot nicer. So jump down into the description if you want to jump to the various jump links. I'll have little video links down there where you can just cut to the part that interests you. Give a thumbs up, like, and subscribe, and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, now the first thing to note is tables are tabular data. They're formed by rows and columns. So you can see here I have a basic table with 9 boxes. We call these boxes cells. Now a table is made up of first rows. So you have a single row, and then within that table you have what are known as data cells. So you can see here I have 3 table data cells within that first row, and those are constituted by the TD tag, which stands for table data cell. The TR tag is what we use for table row. There's no such thing as a column cell. You get columns by adding rows and data cells together, which eventually stack up into columns. So really there's only 2 main tags that you're going to be using, the table row and the table data cell tag. Now, of course, there's a few other tags that we're going to be looking at here, but that's the basics of forming an HTML table. Now you can see here in this example, this is the exact same thing. We have 9 cells, so we have 3 columns and 3 TDs in each one of those columns. And you can see over here in the left-hand sidebar, we are looking at the same thing. So you can see here in the real code, we start out with a tag called table. And then inside of the table tag, we have our first row, which is that row right there. So that belongs to this first row right here. And we have 1, 2, 3 data cells. That's that one, and that one. Then we come down here and we make up our second row. So there's our second row. And you kind of get the idea here. These just basically continue on. This one has 3 data cells as well. One important thing to note here is that when you start building tables, you can't have a row with 2 and the next row with 3 and the next row with 4. You have to have an equal amount of data cells within each row when you start. I'll show you how you can merge those in a minute. Now in this next slide here, I want to show you the spans. So whenever you have 2 cells and you want to merge those together, we call that a span. Now in HTML, there's only 2 types of span. The first is what we call a rowspan, and the second is called a colspan. Now people always get these 2 confused, but the type of span we see over here in cell 4, where we have these things merged together, is what's known as a colspan. So a lot of people will think this is a row span because we're working in a row. But if we look at this, in fact, this individual cell here, so cell 4 is spanning column and column. So it's actually spanning 2 columns, which is why we call it a colspan. Okay, let's look here at the next slide. And this one you can see we have both a row span and a colspan. So over here, this one is a colspan, and this one is a row span because it's spanning row 1 and row 2. So cell 3 is a row span, cell 4 is a colspan, and we can have both together in a single table. That's completely fine. All right, the next thing I want to cover is cell alignment. So within each individual table data cell, you can align the contents of that cell to the top, the middle, and the bottom. And that only has to do with vertical alignment. So when you're doing vertical, the keyword is top, middle, or bottom, and then we'll align the contents of the cell accordingly. Now, when we're dealing with horizontal alignment, we use the keywords left, center, and right to align things along those axes. And you can see you can definitely use both. So I can align some content in the upper right, and I would use the top for the vertical and right for the horizontal, and my content would be pushed up to the top right of the cell. Now, I mentioned this earlier, but there are a few extra tags associated with tables. And this is very common in tables where you might have a row, thead here up at the top stands for table header. So this entire row is the thead tag, and then these 3 rows constitute the table body, and then this entire row here constitutes the footer, or the tfoot. Now these 3 tags are actually optional. You technically don't need them to create a table, but if you want to do advanced things where you have header and footer rows that are separate from the body, it's recommended that you add these rows for more semantic code. Next, we're going to cover cell padding. Now, cell padding refers to the cushion around the cells. So between the border, this little white line designates the border. This little blue box right here is the content, and the padding is this area right here. It's basically like a cushion. You can see here that the letter T got forced down onto its own line because there wasn't enough room, because the padding here is preventing content from going all the way to the edge of the border. So it's like an invisible cushion, and it's called cell padding. Now, very similar to cell padding, in fact, they look the same when you're doing them in code, is cell spacing. However, they are different. Cell spacing doesn't refer to the cushion in the inside of the cell. It actually refers to the space between cells. This is actually not the border, so the border doesn't get thicker. Rather, the actual space between cells increases. We can also change the width and height of cells. This is something that has traditionally been kind of a nightmare with tables, because tables tend to want to rearrange or size themselves according to the content inside the cell. And it's not consistent between all the different browsers. So we can override the default width and height of cells by just adding width and height properties. So you can see here in this little simple example, this row right here obviously has a much taller height than the other rows. Once you declare a height to a single cell, every single cell in that row will get that height. And same thing here with the column. This column obviously has a much wider width than the other 2 columns, this one and this one. And again, once I declare a width in a cell, the entire column will get that same width. And we can mix and match them and mess around with widths and heights. Now, lastly, we can put tables inside of tables and do some crazy things like this. So in this example, I could have an entire separate table that's embedded inside of an individual cell. And that's definitely possible and completely semantic and normal to do. Maybe I shouldn't say it's normal to do. This is what we used to do in the late 90s when we would build websites. In fact, you can really put any HTML tag inside of a table data cell. All right, so that's enough of the talk about the basics. Let's jump right into some code and show you a really quick best practice for creating tables, and then how you can, a simple method I've come up with for how you can very easily build a table based off of a picture. So if you already know some complex shape you want to build a table off, I'll show you a few steps to where you can do them without really overthinking it as far as the rows and spans go. All right, and lastly, before we jump into the code here, I just wanted to mention the deprecated table attributes. Now you'll notice in this exercise I've been talking about cell padding and spacing, and we used to do all of those things with HTML attributes right inside of the HTML. Those have since been deprecated, and the recommended way is to use CSS instead. Now you can see the old on the left, the old attribute names, and then the corresponding CSS values on the right that you're encouraged to use instead. In the code sample, I'm going to use a couple of the deprecated values, as I don't want to do CSS for everything while I'm doing the HTML, just to help you visualize, but just be aware CSS is the new recommended way for doing all of these attributes. All right, so this is the table that we are going to replicate from scratch. You could see this could be used for like a receipt or an order form or an invoice or something, but really it's just a single table. So if we look at this, the basic method for creating tables is you need to first start with a grid. So when I look at a table like this, I need to say how many rows and how many columns are there. So if we kind of look at this thing and we break it down, we can ignore the header and the footer. There's obviously sort of a column right here. There's a column right here. There's our first row, kind of goes across like this. Then we have another row right here. And then we have another row right here. And then we have a last row right here. Right? Whoops, that one kind of got cut off. So that's the overall feel of the table. Now, I know that this total is, these two cells are actually merged together, but we can ignore that for right now in this simple example. So then you simply just count. So I have 1 column, 2 columns, 3 columns by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows. So this is going to be a 5-row by 3-column table. And then the next step 2, once you've determined the overall rows and columns, is just build a really simple grid with all of those table data cells. So let's do that next. All right, so the first thing we need to do is just add the table tag. So I'm going to turn on a property here called border equals 1. Now, typically you would do borders with CSS, but there is this border property. And if you don't have it set to a 1-pixel border, you actually won't see the borders when you're doing your previewing. So I'm going to turn that on, and then I'm going to create my first row. So we create a table row tag, and then inside of that row, you remember we have 3 columns. So I need 3 TD tags. So I'll just create one and then copy and paste here. So I'll do TD1, and then I'm just going to copy this guy down twice. So 1, 2, and then go ahead and save. And you can see over here, there my table appears. And I'll just renumber these. So 1, 2, 3. Perfect. So there's my first row, and I have 3 cells. Now I just need, I think we had 5 total rows, right? So I'm just going to copy and paste this. So I'll copy this one and say paste, 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 paste. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows. Let me save that. You can then see all those rows there. And then you renumber. Now this numbering is important, because when you start doing your spans, your row spans and col spans, it's really important to have these numbers in place. They'll really help you. So I'm going to hurry and number this. 8, 9, 10, let's see, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. All right, so we save that and we update, and we can see over there, sure enough, there's our table. Now, just so you can see a few of those extra properties here, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to set the width of this table to be, I don't know, 500 pixels or something like that. Sorry, not px, 500. And you can see right away the table is stretching out there, so that looks like it's a little big. Maybe I'll set that down to 300 so we can see the full thing there in the preview. That's better. Let's go all the way down to 200. And then I can also mess around with the height. So I'm going to come in here and set the height to 200 as well. Now again, typically you would mess around with widths and heights in CSS, but I just want to demonstrate this. All right, now I'm going to add that cell spacing property because it's really easy to see once you have your table. So I'm going to say cell spacing equals 20, something really large, and you can really see what happens, right? That space in between the cells got all that big, giant extra bit of space. So I'm going to delete that. We'll leave the width and height in there. And now let's go ahead and do our merging. So we know that the first 3 rows were normal, but this last row right here only had 2 cells, the total and then the total sale price. So 13 and 14 need to be merged together. So the way I recommend you do this is you come down to the cell that starts the merging. So in other words, 13 is going to merge into 14. I like to think left to right and top to bottom. So if 5 and 8 were merged together, 8 doesn't merge into 5, rather 5 merges into 8. Top down and then left to right. So in this case right here, I'm going to come to cell 13. So let's go find cell 13. That's right down here. And this is why I recommend you number them, because then you can easily find them in your code. And I'm going to add in, let me have you guess, which type of span is this? This is a col span because I'm spanning these 2 columns. Now the number inside of the col span property is how many literal columns it's going to be spanning. So in my case, 1 and 2. So 2 columns are going to span together. So the number here I would put would be 2. Okay, then here's the important part. Before you save and refresh, you need to go find the cell that it's merging into, in this case 14, and just delete the entire cell. Then you save and then refresh, and you can see, sure enough, those are 2 now merged together. And that's the important thing. I want to show you what happens if I do that in the opposite way. So I'm going to undo. Now, if I save before I delete cell 14, watch what happens. See, I just hit save. See how my entire table breaks? And then it gets really difficult to figure out which cells are merging into which cells because everything is broken in here. So you always have to remember to, when you add a col span in, or a row span, you have to delete the cell that it merges into first, then save and refresh and make sure it looks correct. Now, just for simplicity's sake, or for it to show you a row span, I'm going to merge cells 6 through 12 together. So again, if those were merged together, I start on 612 because I start on cell 6 because I'm merging down. So let's find cell 6. We come in here, and this is going to be a row span. So we say row span equals, And then you can see this is going to be 3. 1, 2, 3, because I'm merging down 3 rows. So I put the number 3 in there. And then I need to delete the other 2 cells. So cell 9 I need to delete, and cell 12. So I come find cell 9, I delete it. I find cell 12, I delete it. Then go ahead and save. And whoops, I spelled that wrong. Rowspan, there we go. And sure enough, those are then all merged together. And if you just do that simple step, you'll be able to build any sort of complex table that comes your way. So those are my easy steps for labeling tables and then doing your spans. After you have everything sort of spanned the correct way, so you build your grid, you do your spans, and then the third step is you can then further align and adjust things accordingly. So just to demonstrate this, maybe I want the contents of this to be at the bottom right. So I'm going to come into cell 6, and I'm going to use the align property, and I'll set that to right. Remember, that's for the horizontal alignment. So I'll save, and you can see, sure enough, it jumps over. And then I'll also add in the V align, that's the vertical align property, and I'll set that to bottom and save, and it jumps down to the bottom. So now my content is aligned down there. Now, the last thing I'll do here is show you how we can mess around with the height, and then how we can do a table inside of a table. So let's say I wanted, for some reason, this row right here, row 7, starting with this cell, to be taller than the rest. Well, I can come into row 7, the table data cell, and I can just give this a height property. So I can say height equals, and I don't know, maybe let's make it 100 pixels. Or sorry, not px, just 100, and save. And you can see, sure enough, that now is 100, but because I have an overall constraint of height of 200, all the other rows sort of squished and auto-adjusted as best they could as well. So this is what I mean when tables try to resize themselves, because you can have conflicting rules. So you have to be careful with your heights and widths, but that's how you can override a single individual piece. Now lastly, let's say for some reason I want to come into cell number 6 and build another table inside of there. Well, I can just come into cell 6. So I'm going to delete the 6 in this case and just hit return to give myself some room. And then inside of the actual table data cell, you just paste the entire table code. So to keep things simple, I'm actually just going to copy this entire table code all the way from start to finish. And I'll come inside of cell number 6, and this is going to be a bit messy, but I'm just going to paste. So that entire table code is pasted in there, and I'm going to save. And you can now see I've got that entire table is built inside of that cell 6. And again, that's very messy, but that's how you can make a table. I'm going to undo that, back up and undo a table inside of a table. Okay, so that's the basics for creating your tables and building your tables. Now, the last thing we're going to cover in this tutorial is how we can then style the tables and have some fancy headers, some footers, some CSS styling to make them look much better than the default. Okay, so in this part, we're going to be styling the table. Now, I've already got all the HTML in place. This is basically the exact same as our previous code. The only difference is that I've added in the thead tag. So I have a thead, then I have my row. So this is the header. I've added in the tbody tag, which has the 3 rows, which constitute the body. And I've added in the tfoot tag, which has the single row of the footer. So there's my head, there's the body, and there's the foot. And that's how you can add those in HTML as well. Now I've just put in some little dummy content here to simulate this. Let's go ahead and start the CSS. Now I have right now border equals 1, and that's strictly so you can see the border here over in the preview. But what I want to do is first show you a single property, then I'm going to remove this border equals 1 because we're going to be doing that with CSS. So you can see here, I'm going to open up my table code, and I just have some basic code in here for a background color and a font and whatnot like that. So really, the important code here is going to start out in our table. Now, notice that in the table itself, I have a class of invoice table. So I'm going to be using this class as I do my styling on the table, just in case you have other tables you're working with on a single page. So let's go ahead and come back here to the CSS, and I'll go ahead and create my first table. So it's dot invoice table. And then we're going to add our first bit of properties here. Now, the first one I want to show you is a property called border-collapse. And we're going to set this property to collapse. And watch what happens as soon as I save to the borders over here. So I'm going to save that. Notice how they all collapsed down to a single pixel. with HTML tables, they're kind of an old tag, so the way the borders behave is a little bit strange. When you say border equals 1, it's really not 1 pixel. It means like 1 unit of border because they have like a bit of a bevel embedded. So this border collapse property actually collapses all those inner bevels and actually does sort of make them 1 pixel, if you will. So that's the first property we're going to add. Now that I've added that property and demonstrated what happens there, I'm actually going to go into the HTML and delete the border equals 1 because we don't need it here. So I'll go ahead and save that. There's not going to be any borders, and we'll continue working here. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is just give this table some width. So maybe I'm going to say width equals 25 ems or something like that. So it's going to space itself out a little bit, which is fine. I'm actually going to make this preview fairly small as we're working here. You can watch it update in real time. The next thing I'm going to do is add in a background color, so we'll be able to see the bounds here. And the background color is just going to be white, so I'll just say FFF. That looks fine. Let's go ahead and add a border dash radius. This is just going to round off the corners, and we'll just say 5 pixels here and save. You can see that's a little bit subtle, but it added that little teeny round right there on that. The next thing we're going to do is add some shadow. So this is going to be a box shadow. And we're going to say 0 pixels, 10 pixels, 30 pixels. I'm just looking off my note here. I'm not making up these numbers off the top of my head. And then the color is going to be RGBA. And we're going to say 000 for black. And then the alpha value is going to be 0.15 for 15%. So let's go ahead and save. Now you can see that just adds a subtle shadow underneath here. That's pushed away 10 pixels and 30 pixels. So 10 down, 30 down, 10 across, has a 5 pixel blur. Anyway, and we have a little bit of a box shadow. All right, next thing we're going to do is add in some margin. So let's say margin, I don't know, maybe 25 pixels and auto. This is just going to center up our little receipt, I guess I'll call it, invoice inside of the browser preview window there. And that should pretty much do it for the main tag. Okay, so let's move down. And our next one, we're going to be working on the table header. So we'll use this same invoice table, and we're going to say thead tr. So this will only affect the row that's inside of the table head, and we know there's only one. So let's go ahead and give this guy a border dash bottom. And we're going to say 1 pixel dashed, and then a color. And I'm just going to say gray. And save. And you can see that adds a 1 pixel dashed border right inside of there. So that looks fine. Now I'm basically going to copy this and paste it because I want to do the same thing except for the footer. So tfoot, except instead of border bottom, this one's going to be border dash top. And save. And now I've got another little border above the last footer. So that's fine there. Next thing we're going to do is mess around with the table data cells inside of the header. So we can create a rule in here called invoice table, and then thead, and then td. Now I'm writing these really long selectors because it's easier for you, I think, in CSS to kind of see the nesting order. So this is the table data cell, inside of a table row, inside of the table head, inside of that invoice table. So if we hover over this, you can kind of see the structure there of exactly what elements I'm affecting. Now, in this specific property, we're going to add some font size. So let's change the font size. We'll just make this 16 pixels and save. So you can see that changes that a little bit. Then we're going to change the letter spacing to just 1 pixel. That's going to space out the letter spacing a little bit in that header row. And let's go ahead and make a color. We'll make this gray as well. So you can see the color just shifted there. And then let's give this some padding. So I'm going to give this padding of 8 pixels to kind of push everything away from the edges. So again, this is affecting each individual data cell. So that data cell, and that data cell that's inside of our thead. Okay, that looks fine. Now we're going to do basically a similar thing for our footer. So I'm going to copy this entire thing and paste it down below. But instead of thead, this is going to be tfoot. So this is going to be affecting the bottom row here. And the color, let's make green. And then we'll change the, I don't know, maybe we'll make it slightly larger. So we'll make it 18 pixels or something like that for that footer row. So that looks fine there. And let's go ahead and mess around with the body as well. So I'm going to copy this one more time, paste it, and instead of tfoot, it's going to be tbody. So this is going to affect each individual cell inside of the body. Now, I don't want font size to be any different, so I'll delete that. I'll delete letter spacing, I'll delete color. Really, all I want to mess around with is the padding. So we'll delete color, and let's go ahead and save. And we'll consider that good enough. So that's what our body area is going to be looking like. And the last few things from this point are just a little bit of tweaks. So one thing we can do is we can write a selector. So invoice table space thead space tr td colon nth dash last dash child and 1 and save. Okay, not save, but create the rule. So what this is kind of a complicated selector here, but we're affecting the last child that's a type of a table data cell in the row in the table header. So if I go look at my HTML, this is going to affect only that single TD tag because it's the last child of the TDs. Okay, so that's what we're affecting right here. And we're just going to simply say text align, text dash align, right, okay, and save. And you can see, sure enough, that very last one went over to the right side. Now I can group this in a group selector. I could use the fancy new is selector, but we're just going to do this in a group. So I'll hit comma, paste. So basically I want to affect the last children of each of the rows. So I'll say thead, I'll say tbody, and then I'll say tfoot. And save, and now those are all aligned to the right. So the very last row gets right aligned. The very last column, I guess I should say, that's kind of like a column selector to get all of those guys. Perfect. Okay, so the only other thing that I maybe want to do here is mess around with these little guys. So you can see in my HTML, I have the word drink, and then next to it I have a span, okay? And then there's this word called large or small or no pickle, right? So I want to make that word slightly different to offset it. So let's come back here to our CSS and we'll add another rule here. So that one is going to be for the .invoice table. So I'm starting all these the same. So invoice table tbody, because that class only exists in the tbody. And then I'll just say span. Okay. And what I'm going to do here is we're going to change the font size. So make the font size like 12 pixels, so something a bit smaller. So let's save. You can see that decreases the font size there. And then we'll also maybe make the color gray on those. Whoops, color gray, so they just kind of don't stand out as much, something like that. And there you go. So there's a full entire table completely styled from start to finish with just some basic CSS to make them a little bit nicer. You can do all sorts of things with CSS. I could make the background of the first entire row and the last entire row different. You can even do hover effects where the entire row is hovered upon. When you roll your scroll over rows, you can make those. You can do zebra striping where every other row in a table is a slightly different color. That really works well if you have like a lot of columns and you're scanning back and forth. The zebra striping them helps you follow along a single row as you're sort of scanning. Anyway, there's a lot of different things you can do with tables and styling them. So I hope this video, although it's actually not super long, gives you a really good idea of how to build tables from start to finish and how you can style tables. I hope to see you in the next one. Like, subscribe, thumbs up, share, and we'll see you later.